Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual Intro to Ethnic Studies slide. I hope everyone is doing well. First and foremost, I really, truly hope that everyone is doing well and that you all are taking care of yourselves, that your families are well. There's a lot of challenges right now because of coronavirus and because of, you know, the pandemic and the various impacts it has had on various different people's lives. And so I just definitely want to acknowledge that. And I think the most important thing is definitely that, we take care of ourselves, our loved ones, our communities during this time. And so if you're feeling anxious about anything in relation to this class, please just let me know. If you're missing any assignments, you have until the last week of school, which is the last day of class for us is Wednesday, May 20th. So until Wednesday, May 20th, you have time to turn in late assignments. I would say just turn in any assignments that you can if you haven't already turned them in. Some folks are, just fine. So if this doesn't relate to you, please don't worry about it. But again, I think we want to prioritize our humanity, prioritize our well-being, and really think about a world that we want to live in during this time. And that's what I'm prioritizing as well in terms of, for this class too. And so try your best not to be anxious about things related to this class. If you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. And I'm totally confident that we can end this semester strong. And, that's the goal and the objective. Okay. So please reach out to me. And again, I sincerely hope everyone is doing well. All right. So let's get started with the presentation. So there is a final manifesto project as well as a final manifesto reflection that's due on Wednesday, May 20th, which will be the last day of class for us. The last week of school is that week. And so your manifesto is a declaration on an issue related to ethnic studies. And the manifesto should include these three parts: a description of the context and position from which you write, a statement of your key beliefs, and a clear set of desires, demands, or plans for the future. Your manifesto can be as short or long as you like. You can incorporate visuals. You can use just visuals. You can write a manifesto. It can be as short or long as you like. Also, it can be audio. You can record yourself making your declarations, or make a video of yourself making your declarations, as long as it includes these three parts. And so here's some, before we get into examples, let's talk about the reflection. This is another assignment. So the manifesto reflection assignment is worth 5 points, and you are going to pick a manifesto. There's examples given to you, or you can do a web search, or you can use a manifesto that you already may be familiar with and just reflect on it. And it's worth 5 points. The details of this assignment is under the assignments tab on Canvas. The final manifesto is worth 20 points, right? And again, that's where it could be as short or long as you like, but it needs to be a declaration of something related to ethnic studies. If you like, you can also pair up with someone or other people and make this a group manifesto project, which was what was initially planned for this assignment before we went into remote learning. But if you do a group manifesto with others, all you need is one manifesto for everyone in the group. Make sure it still includes these three parts, but every person still has to write their own reflection. The reflection assignment is still, every person in a group must write the reflection. So that's only if you want to be in a group for the final manifesto. If not, you are just going to do the manifesto yourself and turn it in. Okay, we had to change it due to again, moving to online. Okay, so you got 2 assignments related to the manifesto: the final manifesto, in which you make your declaration, it's worth 20 points, and the manifesto reflection, in which you read or look at a manifesto and reflect on it, for 5 points. So here are some examples of manifestos from the web. Here's a manifesto on architecture. Okay, so some Architects came together and created a manifesto, right? A list of demands and a vision for the future about architecture, including things like architecture must be better than when it replaces, holding government accountable, wanting public input. Also, bad buildings to be eliminated. It should think about, environmentalism, our environment. This is a manifesto on architecture. You can use this one to reflect on it if you like. Here's a manifesto I just found on the web. Kill your TV, sing, champion the underdog. This manifesto is making a declaration with demands and vision for the future, right? The Black Panther Party 10-point program is a manifesto in which they made their demands, right? Even though it's not necessarily referred to as a manifesto often, this is an example of a manifesto. Some other examples of manifestos include the Gay Liberation Front Manifesto from 1971, a Chicano-Mexicano Manifesto organizing in the 80s, the Radical Women Manifesto, Socialist Feminist Theory, Program, and Organizational Structure. Okay, so here's your rubric. You can find the rubrics under the Assignments tab on Canvas for the final manifesto project. Purpose, content, and organization, all worth 5 points. And then the feel of your manifesto. Is it compelling? Does it hook the reader? Does it sustain interest throughout? Okay, so basically, go ahead and make your manifesto in whatever way you see fit, and make your declaration. What would you like to see for the future? You could think of liberation, you could think of the current pandemic, you can think of whatever it may be, okay? Food, water, animal rights, schools, vehicles, pollution, whatever your manifesto is, just make sure it connects to ethnic studies in some way, which connects to pretty much, humanity and people power and justice and things like that. Reach out if you have any questions about the manifesto project, the manifesto reflection assignment, or the rubric. Okay, so we're going to talk about feminist theories today. So there have been 4 waves of feminism. The first wave started in the mid-19th century, and it was pretty much mostly in Britain and the US. And it really was the women's suffrage movement, and it really was about voting rights for women. And this led to, the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote in the 1920s. But the suffrage movement was very white women-centered, and very racist, right? Not challenging whiteness, only patriarchy, okay? And then you have second wave feminism from the 60s to 70s. And this was a split. You really got to see a split. There was 2 different groups within the second wave feminism. There was one group that really just wanted equal rights for women, and an end to discriminatory laws in the home and work. And this is a lot of the dominant culture around feminism, right? White women were really fighting for equal rights during this time. But then there was a second group of feminists within the second wave feminist movement. And they were more radical feminists who wanted a radical shift in patriarchy, were really deconstructing gender roles, and fought for a feminist revolution. Third wave feminism continued to build on the second wave feminism, especially of radical feminists of the 60s and 70s. And so a lot of women of color developed theories like anti-racist and anti-sexist theories that continue to be impactful today. There's a lot of talk about intersectionality. We're looking at the different ways that different parts of our identities impact our lives. Womanhood was redefined, and you see a lot more radical queer theory. So intersectionality is looking at someone's different identities, for example, race, class, ability, age, and not separating one or making one more important than the other, right? But understanding that we are complex human beings and we have many different identities that impact our realities. So Audre Lorde is seen here, and she's saying, Audre Lorde was a very prominent Black feminist. And she said, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Okay, so thinking about intersectionality. Now, the fourth wave of feminism is now. It extends third wave feminism, uses a lot of social media, digital communication for organizing or to get ideas across, or, to represent and express feminist theories. addresses things like body shaming, rape culture, justice for trans people. But there's some decolonial feminists who reject the whole idea of this waves framework that's very popular when talking about feminism. And they like this art right here, which says "No Wave Feminism." And some people critique the ideas of thinking about feminism in waves because it tends to make things separate within a historical context that really was more fluid and had a flow. Also, some people reject the whole idea of wave feminism in order to understand feminism throughout history, because they say it's rooted mostly in white women's feminism, right? And so let's go on to the Black Feminist Statement of April 1977, which is the Combahee River Collective Statement. And in the video with Jamal Jones on Radical Queer Theory, Jamal actually referenced the Combahee River Collective when he was talking about identity, right? And so the Combahee River Collective were a group of Black feminists in Boston who were took their name from Harriet Tubman, from an incident in which Harriet Tubman in North Carolina helped free over 750 enslaved people during the Civil War. And yes, this was in North Carolina, okay? And so that's where they took the name from, the great Harriet Tubman and her actions on during the Civil War, in which she freed 750 to 800 people, okay? And so the Combahee Women Collective felt that it was necessary to form a Black queer radical women group because of the racism within the feminist movement of their times. And so the theory and practice centered on the reality of systems of oppression as interlocking. So they didn't just look at themselves as women like the white feminist movement tended to do. Just look at women and just look at sameness and saying, hey, we're all women, so we all should struggle together and just, have each other's backs. But that was really erasing all the different identities that many different diverse women had within the movements, right? And so the Combahee River Collective really looked at interlocking systems of oppression like racism, sexism, heterosexism, class oppression, and addressed these things. So they had four major topics. The four major topics were the genesis of contemporary Black feminism, what we believe, problem in organizing Black women, and Black feminist issues and practice. And so the genesis of Black feminism, they talked about how second wave feminism was racist and classist. White women who were more privileged really weren't trying to talk about racism. They weren't talking about classes, and they weren't talking about capitalism and the destruction of that. They were just talking about more the things that they experienced in this patriarchal society, right? The oppression that they may experience as women in this patriarchal society, but ignoring race, class, and other interlocking oppressions, right? So the Black Feminist Statement said that there needed to be a separate Black female group that was anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, and anti-capitalist. So they believed in centering Black women's struggles, refusing the margins, right, to other groups' liberation. So they refused to be in the margin, and a lot of white feminist movements during second wave and first wave feminism during those times really centered white women's experiences and made that seem as if that was the norm. And so women in the Combahee Collective rejected that, and they refused to live on the margins and wanted to centralize their own experiences. And this is where the idea of identity politics comes from. It actually is rooted in these Black radical women. And there's been a lot of talk about identity politics, in recent political conversations where there's, like conservative and liberal folks have different opinions of identity politics. But really the root of identity politics is radical. And, they said in the statement, the most profound and radical politics comes directly from our own identity, as opposed to working to end someone else's oppression. And so they understood that that whoever was interested in liberation and moving forward had to center themselves, their identities, and their experiences within the struggle. in order to best address what was really going on in our society. They also wanted to make clear that they weren't anti-male. They wanted to struggle with the Black men for total liberation of racism as well as sexism. They're socialists, so they wanted an end to capitalism, imperialism, as well as patriarchy. And they actually understood patriarchy to come from capitalism and largely imperialism. And they believed in a socialist revolution, but one that was feminist and one that was anti-racist. And they critiqued Marx or expanded Marxist theory by saying that, Marxist theory is great to understand class, but it needed to be, Marxist theory needs to be expanded in order to address racism and sexism, which a lot of people have done throughout the years within Marxism, have extended it and said, yeah, Marxism talks great about class, but we also need to extend that to talk about the different types of oppression in society, right? It's not like, oh, we're just all poor and that's it, right? There might be racism, there might be sexism, there might be transphobia that also affect people's lives and are also interlocking parts of oppression. So what we believe, they rejected lesbian separatism, the idea that, lesbians wanted to be completely separated from men and have nothing to do with men. There were people who were organizing for that, right? And the Black feminist statement rejected that completely. They didn't see men as inherently bad, and they didn't support essentialism. In the beginning of semester, we talked about essentialism with Omi and Winot, in which the idea, really the xenophobic idea that's rooted in xenophobia, I should say, in which was justified to discriminate against certain people, right? Because it's the idea that groups of people have essential characteristics that are inherent in them, right? That can't really be changed, right? And so a lot of times that was used in the US to justify racism, right? Like, oh, this group of people is inherently, wrong or is inherently unintelligent, and so we have to think for them, or things like that, right? Essentialism. They also addressed Black patriarchy within nationalist movements like the Black Panther Party or different Black nationalist movements. They called out patriarchy, right? And they also said that it was important for the most oppressed people within society to lead and inform the struggle for liberation, because they understand best oppression within our society. So they should then be the leaders, not someone who, they shouldn't have someone speak for them, right? That's not part of that group. But those who are most oppressed should be the ones to lead and to inform, right? And to be listened to, right? Because they can understand really well the chains within the society and be the ones to help to break them, right? Also, they said white women are responsible for eliminating racism within white feminist movements. No one else, right? Not Black women, not other women of color. It's white women that are responsible for addressing racism within these white circles, right? Which is also very important. So white feminism looks at the way, so now we're going to talk about mainstream versus radical feminism. And so white feminism looks at the ways that privileged white women are impacted by patriarchy, right? It lacks a serious analysis of factors like race and class. So here's a video on white feminism.
Oh, white women, why do you think everything is about you? Y'all have willfully ignored and excluded the contributions of women of color to women's rights organizing for way too long, including all those times you chose the patriarchy over sisterhood. Well, not today, white feminists. Not today. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton have been America's feminist darlings since forever ago, launching the fight for equality, well, for white women. In her speech to the state legislature of New York in 1854, Stanton said, "We are moral, virtuous, and intelligent, and yet by your laws we are classed with idiots, lunatics, and Negroes." And her fellow suffragette leader, Anthony, once said, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work or demand the ballot with a Negro and not the woman." That's right. First wave feminism was hella racist. It fought for white women's rights by arguing against the rights of, as Stanton called them, degraded Black men. Black men having the right to vote before upper-class white women? The horror. It gets worse. Not only were Black women excluded from the suffragette movement, organizers of the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. asked them to march at the back of the line. They were like, hey girls, you can hang back for like another 45 years until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay, thanks. Bye. Fast forward to the 1960s and 1970s, and this culture of excluding women of color from feminist organizing spaces becomes more multi-layered.
The ways that they're excluded would be in terms of leadership, in terms of which communities are being organized, in terms of which topics are being organized around, as well as which resources are being allocated to kind of make social change.
Dr. Salamisha Tillett is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and the co-founder of A Long Walk Home, a nonprofit that uses art to end violence against women and girls.
Excluding women of color, you're not actually tackling the crux of the ways in which gender equality and racial inequality and economic inequality work in concert with each other.
And that's the key. While white feminists have the privilege to focus on issues like reproductive health, sexual freedom, and wage equality, women of color have had to fight sexism and structural and institutional racism. But that hasn't stopped them. From women like Sojourner Truth and Ida B. Wells, feminist writers and activists who fought for African American rights in the late 1800s and early 1900s, to Dolores Huerta, the Chicana who co-founded the United Farm Workers Union in 1962 and transformed the labor movement, to Shirley Chisholm, who was not only the first Black woman elected to Congress, but the first Black candidate to run for the nomination of a major party for the US presidency, to the women of the Black Panther Party, who made up the majority of the organization. Women of color have been smashing the shit out of gender and racial ceilings. They also led and organized marches and campaigns like the original Million Women March in 1997 to protest the economic deterioration of African American communities. And long before celebrities dressed in Black to protest sexual harassment, there was Paulette Barnes, Diane Williams, and Michelle Vincent, Black women who filed lawsuits against their bosses and shaped the sexual harassment laws we have today. Laws created to protect all women. Don't even get us started on Time magazine's blatant erasure of Me Too founder Tarana Burke from its Person of the Year cover, which was all about the movement against sexual harassment that she started a decade ago. And women of color are still out here fighting to save all our behinds. Thanks to the activism of Black women, 98% of whom voted nope to Roy Moore in Alabama, an alleged child molester was not elected to a Senate seat, even though white women overwhelmingly voted for him. You're welcome, America. So why are mainstream feminist organizing circles still leaving out Black and brown women's voices and contributions?
Well, I guess obviously is in terms of leadership, right? So it's not simply like what issues rise to the forefront of women's rights movements, but also who gets to be the voice of feminism. I do think, though, it's much harder for white feminists to identify with the struggles of women of color.
This may explain why, when it comes to organizing efforts around things like Black Lives Matter or the killing of Black women like Sandra Bland, white mainstream feminists tend to be largely silent. Oh, and when it comes to the gender pay gap with white men, women of color are still trailing behind white women, y'all.
If you're talking about gender equality, but not talking about racism, you just don't have effective reform. You can have versions of feminism that don't incorporate thinking about the ways in which people experience multiple forms of oppression. You definitely can have it. Is it as effective? No.
The reality is, to move forward, feminist organizing spaces need to include the issues and leadership of women who are not just from the white upper middle class lean-in bourgeois, but those who exist across different parts of American society, starting with the most vulnerable.
Okay, so we're gonna watch a video in which Angela Davis, activist, educator, revolutionary, critiques mainstream feminism. So before we go into that, let's look at a quote from Abby Martin, who is a journalist from the Bay Area, in which she's talking about Hillary Clinton's type of feminism, right? So she says, as a woman, I completely reject Hillary's brand of bourgeoisie feminism because it leaves out millions of immigrant women, poor women, and the women under her bombs around the world. And so this is again Abby Martin, journalist, and she's from the Bay Area. And of course, Hillary Clinton has supported and pushed for the dropping of many bombs around the world, right? Of different people of color around the world, including Afghanistan, Syria, Palestine, Yemen. And so can we call her a feminist? Is that the kind of feminism that really is looking at liberation when she's promoting bombs being dropped on women, children, and civilians, quote unquote, right? So what is the term bourgeoisie? It's a Marxist term, and it's talking about middle and upper class groups who are invested in property and capital to ensure their economic superiority within the capitalist society. So the bourgeoisie are invested in a capitalist society and are more interested in the protection of property and capital, right? In order to remain in that hierarchy that that capitalism creates, right? And so bourgeoisie feminism is obviously not enough, right? Because it's not looking at class, right? Andrew Davis also critiques glass ceiling feminism, what she calls glass ceiling feminism, in which, glass ceiling feminism is a feminism in which, women fight for the ability to continue to, climb up the ladder, right? The corporate ladder or the economic ladder, right? Because the idea of a glass ceiling is the fact that you can see, the top, but you can't get there because there's a piece of glass that prevents you from, getting to the top, to the ceiling. So some women say, within corporate America, because I'm a woman, I can't be, I get discrimination, so can't be the CEO or different other high level positions. But Angela Davis critiques this type of feminism as well, because she says it's still hierarchical. And she wants us to think about it in the context of capitalism, right? Think about which class does glass ceiling feminism most apply to? And that class of women, are they really invested in all women or just women within their privileged roles, right? Angela also critiques carceral feminism. So carceral talks about prison, imprisonment. So feminism that supports using prison, the judiciary system, the police, right? And so here's this picture. Prison is not feminist, right? And so Angela talks about carceral feminism, in which the police, prosecution, and imprisonment are seen as a solution of violence against women. She sees that as wrong too, and not the answer to true liberation for all women and all people, essentially, right? Carceral feminism really pushed for, the police really getting more involved during domestic violence cases, right? Really pushed for mandatory arrest laws, and mandatory arrest laws were pushed by carceral feminists to try to eliminate police inaction when they were called for domestic violence cases, right? And so it requires the police to make an arrest whenever a domestic violence case is reported. The only issue with this is, well, there's multiple issues with this. One being that the police are themselves oftentimes perpetrators of violence within oppressed communities, right? Also, a lot of times what would happen was that the police would come in and inflict violence on the women, right? Or would arrest people, and prison is actually a violent institution, so violence would just be continued or exemplified, right? Expanded. So there's there's one case in which and there's a lot of similar cases to this, but the police were called in New York because of a domestic violence issue, and so the woman who called the police against her boyfriend was a Black woman. And what they did was they arrested the Black woman, right? Didn't do anything to her male spouse, but arrested the Black woman and took her to the middle of nowhere and beat her up, right? Essentially beat her up. And so the police is not the answer to violence against women, right? And the police and as we know, imprisonment, the prison system, the courts are racist, sexist, transphobic. It's a very capitalist, classist institution, or the vehicles of they promote vehicles of oppression, essentially. So carceral feminism is also not the answer. So here is Andra Davis's critique on mainstream feminism, and she pushes for an abolitionist feminism, in which the abolition of oppression, right? All oppression is the goal of abolitionist feminism. And again, Andra Davis here is critiquing mainstream feminism. So here's some questions to reflect on as you watch the video. You don't have to turn these in, but it's just something to reflect on, right? So one thing is, how does Andra Davis think that intersectionality is most helpful? Why does glass ceiling feminism not apply to women of color who face the most discrimination in society? What does Andra Davis mean when she says inclusion is not enough? And here's a quote: blank richest billionaires control as much wealth as the poorest blank of the population.
And perhaps let me move on to say that, the mainstream feminist movement has made serious mistakes. I often point out that when I wrote a book that was published in 1981 called Women, Race, and Class, everybody started referring to me as a feminist. And my response was, I'm not a feminist. I'm a Black revolutionary. Because I didn't see how the two had anything to do with each other. But I realized that I was talking about a certain kind of feminism, a bourgeois feminism, a feminism that is still, unfortunately, white bourgeois feminism, which is unfortunately the most represented feminism today, and most people think of that as feminism. But that ignores the fact that huge numbers of organic and academic intellectuals who are women of color have transformed the very nature of feminism. And the hallmark of feminism today is what we call intersectionality, a recognition of and not only the interrelating character of identities, but as I frequently say, I think intersectionality is most helpful when we think about the intersectionality of social justice struggles. The mistake made by mainstream feminism and its continued reliance on categorical representations of women. As soon as one assumes that women can be categorically represented, it means that there is some clandestine racialization happening there, right? And you hear the term glass ceiling feminism. I don't know whether you have that here. Glass ceiling feminism. This is what Hillary Clinton represented. But glass ceiling feminism is represented, it's grounded from the very outset in hierarchies. I mean, how else does that metaphor work? Those who are already high enough to reach the ceiling are probably white, and then if they're not white, they are already affluent because they're at the top. All they have to do is pushed through the ceiling. And as long as I have identified as a feminist, it has been clear to me that any feminism that privileges those who already have privilege is bound to be irrelevant to poor women, working class women, women of color, trans women of color. If standards for feminism are created by those who have already ascended economic hierarchies and are attempting to make the last climb to the top, how is this relevant to women who are at the very bottom? Revolutionary hope resides precisely among those women who have been abandoned by history and who are now standing up and making their demands heard. I truly believe, and men should applaud this, that this is the era of women. I truly believe that. And I am referring not to the women who only have to break the ceiling to get where they want to go. But I'm referring to the women at the very bottom, poor women, Black women, Muslim women, indigenous women, queer women, trans women. As a matter of fact, trans women of color have been most despised, most subject to state violence, most subject to individual violence. And so it seems to me that we can say that people who have suffered in that way, when they begin to rise, the whole world will rise with them. The whole world will rise with them. If we stand up against racism, we want much more than inclusion. Inclusion is not enough. Diversity is not enough. And as a matter of fact, we do not wish to be included in a racist society. If we say no to heteropatriarchy, then we do not want to be assimilated into a misogynist and heteropatriarchal society. If we say no to poverty, we do not want to be contained by a capitalist structure that values profits more than human beings. If we recognize that those who wanted to solve the problem of slavery by creating more humane forms of slavery were employing the logic of racism, we say that those who call for police reform and prison reform while retaining the racist structures as they pretend to address the problems of racism, that they are absolutely wrong. And this is why we say no to carceral feminism and yes to abolition feminism. Yes to abolition feminism. And so I want to conclude by suggesting that our notion of revolution, our notions of revolution, need to be far more capacious than they have been in the past. Certainly, we need to dispose of what has become an unmanageable system of global capitalism that permits the 8 richest billionaires in the world to control as much wealth as the poorest half of the population. That is absolutely obscene. And even those billionaires should think that it's obscene. But also recognize that we must be prepared to continually challenge that which appears to us to be most normal. Revolution upsets normative processes, class-based, gender-based, race-based, sexuality-based, ability-based, and I'm just beginning the list. And in this sense, there will always be revolutions looming in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the 8 richest billionaires control as much wealth as the poorest half of the population, right? Okay. And so I want to point you to the zine that is part of the reading for this week, Asian American Feminist Antibodies, Care in the Time of Coronavirus. And it's from the Asian American Feminist Collective, which is based in New York. And it came out on March 2020. So definitely take a look at the zine. It's part of the readings for this week again. The link is in the syllabus, the updated syllabus. And also, this is their Instagram handle. Let's see. aafc.nyc. And so this is their, you can even call this a manifesto or their statement on their website, Asian American Feminist Collective, right? And the website is asianamfeminism.org/about. So saying Asian/American feminism is an ever-evolving practice that seeks to address the multi-dimensional ways Asian-American people confront systems of power at the intersections of race, gender, class, sexuality, religion, disability, migration history, and citizenship and immigration status. We are indebted to ways Black feminist thought and third world feminist movements enable us to think and act critically through our own positionalities to address the systems of anti-Black racism, settler colonialism, and xenophobia. So very powerful statement from Asian American Feminist Collective, and they continue to be active. This is a look at their current leadership committee. This is something that just came out from in Teen Vogue. Anti-Asian racism is on the rise during coronavirus, but it's nothing new. So it's a great article on Teen Vogue. And it's actually talking about the Asian American Feminist Collective zine that is part of our reading. Remember, the link is in the syllabus. And here is a picture from their Instagram of a recent Zoom event that they had. Sisters and Siblings in the Struggle, COVID-19 plus Black plus Asian American Feminist Solidarities. And so really important work that they're doing. So definitely check them out and read through that zine. Here is an optional talk from Angela Davis, How Does Change Happen? It's about 50 minutes long. And as you watch the talk by Angela Davis, How Does Change Happen? Here's some suggested reflection questions to think about. This is a really timeless talk. It was probably done maybe a little less than a decade ago, but Angela really is breaking down how change occurs in our society, and it's really inspiring, and she really just gets to the root of how does change happen, and ways that we can ensure that we live in a liberated society, right? Here is also another video. It's a talk from April 23rd, 2020, in which it was talking about confronting anti-Asian racism in the time of coronavirus. And there are also some reflection questions. And this is about an hour, a little over an hour long. And both of these videos are really great and can help inspire your manifesto project. And I recommend that you watch at least one of these videos to, again, help you inform your manifesto project and just to be inspired to better understand some of these important issues going on, and also how change actually happens, because it could feel daunting sometimes when you learn about the different types of oppression that exist within our world, but it's also important to realize that throughout US history and throughout the history of imperialism, people have fought back, and it's impacted the ways that people are treated and the realities that people face within society. So even though imperialism and racism and capitalism exist today, there's always been a struggle against it, and it's resulted in changes that sometimes aren't acknowledged but are still very important, right? And also, anti-Asian racism right now in the time of coronavirus is very relevant, and again, it can inform your manifesto as well, right? Okay, so take care. I will be talking to you all soon, and again, if you have any questions, any concerns about any assignments, please do not hesitate to reach out via email. My email is on the syllabus, but you could also just email me on Canvas. And have a great one. Okay, take care.